And welcome to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, we're talking about jazz icon Dexter Gordon, and on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called One Flight Up, released in 1964. So this album was recorded during Dexter's days in Paris, before he migrated to Scandinavia. One of the highlights from this album is the length of the songs. They run from the typical 3 to 5 minutes to as long as 20 minutes. There's a track that runs up to 18 minutes long, the song Tanya, and an 11-minute song called Copin the Heaven. Tanya is a simple, sweet song and is a jazz classic today, especially a favorite with saxophonists. In this album, it's performed by pianist Kenny Drew and bass by Donald Byrd, with Gordon on tenor saxophone. There's an original composition, Coping the Heaven by Kenny Drew, a beautiful song that's a classic today. It's a beautiful swing melody. Gordon himself is on top form as he navigates the song Down That Dream with its nostalgic horn music. Another emotional horn melody, a bonus in the CD version, is the track Kong Neptune. So this album showcases Dexter's viability as both a band leader and performer. Another album, Dexter Blow Hot and Cold, released in 1955. Now in the 1950s, when Dexter was still a rising star, little was heard of him. This album was only one of 3 of his appearances on record at the time. In this album, it's quintessential jazz classics, and we see Dexter in a quintet starring himself on saxophone, pianist Clark Perkins, bassist Leroy Vinnegar, and Chuck Thompson on drums. It's pretty mainstream jazz tracks, but the album is one of his best from his early days. Another album called Go, released in 1962. This is easily one of Dexter's best albums of all time. This album is to some extent inspired by his first landmark album, Dexter Calling. On this album, Gordon is on tenor saxophone, Sonny Clark is on piano, Butch Warren on bass, and Billy Higgins on drums. Together they weave their way in and out of beautiful melodies. So this album blends the same hard bop influences on Dexter Calling, also some of John Coltrane and Sonny Rollins' playing styles. So this album shows off Gordon's creative side, with classics like I Guess I'll Hang My Tears Out to Dry and Love for Sale. Also, this album showcases how well Gordon connects with the audience in a live performance. It's full of the typical joy and passion that characterized his live shows. There's perfect synchronicity between the performers. Clark on piano provides the perfect backdrop to Gordon's improvisation on saxophone. There's also Higgins, a very underrated drummer. His agility propels the momentum of Gordon and Clark. Butch Warren's bass music provides an anchor to the whole performance. And an album called A Swinging Affair, released in 1962. This album was recorded while Dexter was at his peak in 1962. This album was recorded just 2 days after he recorded his signature album Go, and the band featured pianist Sonny Clark, bassist Butch Warren, and drummer Billy Higgins. Gordon himself composed 2 of the 6 tracks on this album. One of them, the Afro-Cuban themed song Soy Califa, is one of the best tracks in this album. Higgins' drumming adds some sprightly rhythm to the music as Gordon plays on saxophone. Clark vamps up with beautiful minor key chords and adds his own solos. Higgins and Warren are also exceptional with their music. The album also contains 3 classics. Gordon was very fond of jazz classics because they gave him the ability to add his own amazing improvisations to them. The song Don't Explain sees Gordon playing slowly and romantically. You Turn It Into a Kind of Dream in this album plays out in a groovy style, Higgins adding Latin rhythms to the song in the background. The Backbone is a hard bop song with a bossa nova flavor. So that was a compilation of some of Dexter Gordon's best albums of all time, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, we're talking about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Dexter Gordon. And now it's time to talk about some trending album news. Trending right now on the jazz charts for this week is the album Something in the Room She Moves by Julia Holter. Julia's albums are typically mystical and moody, blending the ambient and the classical. This theme is apparent in this album, Something in the Room She Moves. The album's perfect to listen to when you're outdoors or walking through the park. The moods in this album range from melancholy to determination to merriment. The instrumentals comprise synth, wind, and horn music. The track Sun Girl features pulsating keyboard music, an energetic track characterized by its lush vocal delivery. The track Spinning sees Holter's airy vocals with synth, bass, and percussion instrumentals in the backdrop. Talking to the Whisper is a new age jazz song featuring meditative grooves, flute solos, and more. So, Something in the Room She Moves is now trending on the top of the jazz charts for this week. You can purchase the album on iTunes or Amazon MP3. And that was some trending album news right there, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break, be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Dexter Gordon's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And welcome to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, it's about the life and times of Dexter Gordon, and on this hour, we are going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Ballads, released in 1991. So this album showcases Dexter's versatility at ballad playing. Along with people like Gene Ammons and Stanley Tarantine, he was widely regarded as one of the top balladists of the 60s. The next album is called Doing All Right, released in 1961. So the title of this album is quite apt for the season because at the time of the recording of this album, Dexter was in peak form, having produced a hat-trick of successful albums. He was largely unheard of in the 50s, and the 60s showcased a comeback. In this album, he performed a series of beautiful songs like You've Changed, It's You or No One, and Society Red, backed by a stellar lineup of instrumentalists. The next album is called Getting Around, released in 1965, a list of rough and tumble behop tunes, and Dexter's rendition of them is characterized by the subtle and smooth manner in which he plays these melodies. And an album called Body and Soul, released in 1967. So this album is taken from a live performance by Dexter and his band at the famous Monty Marta Club in Copenhagen. In this album, we see Dexter and his quartet take on some much-loved classics like Come Rain or Come Shine, Body and Soul, and Blues Walk. And an album called The Panther, released in 1970. This is one of Dexter Gordon's best albums recorded on the Prestige label in the 70s. A compilation of jazz classics also includes a Dexter Gordon original. So on this hour, we are going to be talking in depth about these albums. This is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. Be right back after that. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, it's about jazz icon Dexter Gordon, and on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Ballads, released in 1991. So this album showcased Dexter's versatility at ballads playing. Along with people like Gene Ammons and Stanley Tarantine, he was widely regarded as one of the top balladists of the 60s. So this album was recorded upon his return from his tour of Europe. He compiled some of his finest ballads into one album. In this album, we see Dexter playing alongside some top names from the hard bop genre. His solos and collaborations are delivered with typical style. For instance, his duet with trumpeter Donald Byrd on the song Darn That Dream, or with the rhythm section of Sonny Clark, Butch Warren and Billy Higgins on the song Don't Explain. There's also a cut from one of his live performances in 1978. The next album is called Doing All Right, released in 1961. So the title of this album is quite apt for the season because at the time of the recording of this album, Dexter was in peak form, having produced a hat-trick of successful albums. He was largely unheard of in the 50s, and the 60s showcased a comeback. In this album, he performs a series of beautiful songs like You've Changed, It's You or No One, and Society Red, backed by a stellar lineup of instrumentalists like trumpeter Freddie Hubbard, pianist Horace Parlan, bassist George Tucker, and drummer Al Harewood. One song in the album, Society Red, was later used as a film soundtrack for the movie Round Midnight. The next album is called Getting Around, released in 1965. So during the 60s, Dexter would alternate between touring Europe and visiting the States for recording sessions. In this album, he teams up with emerging vibraphonist Bobby Hutcherson. In this album, we see their flair at improvising together in hard bop style songs. There's also hit musicians Barry Harris, bassist Bob Crenshaw, and drummer Billy Higgins. A list of rough and tumble behop tunes, and Dexter's renditions of them are characterized by the subtle and smooth manner in which he plays these melodies. Some of the highlights from this album: Man-Hearty Carnival, a beautiful duet between Dexter and Hutcherson; Who Can I Turn To, a heartfelt love ballad; Shiny Stockings, already a classic, becomes immortal in this album. So one highlight of this album is Gordon and Hutcherson's saxophone and vibraphone duets, how well they synchronize their playing together. For example, on the Wild West style song Heartaches, a swinging melody, or the peppy Le Coiffeur, characterized by Gordon's staccato notes. Also, the piano music in the background is reverberating and luscious. And an album called Body and Soul, released in 1967. So this album is taken from a live performance by Dexter and his band at the famous Monty Marta Club in Copenhagen. In this album, we see Dexter and his quartet, pianist Kenny Drew, bassist Neil Hennings Orsted, and drummer Albert Hart, take on some much-loved classics like Come Rain or Come Shine, Body and Soul, and Blues Walk. So these recordings are one of 3 CDs recorded during that live performance in Denmark. There's 2 other CDs called Both Sides of Midnight and Take the A-Train. The complete box set was later reissued under the label Live at the Montmartre Jazz Halls. And an album called The Panther, released in 1970. This is one of Dexter Gordon's best albums, recorded on the Prestige label in the 70s. A highlight of the album is Dexter's collaboration with Tommy Flanagan on piano. They are playing seamlessly weave intricate melodies together. Another highlight of the album, the instrumental recording of Mel Torme's The Christmas Song. A classic rendition of this song by Dexter. His playing is warm and reflective on this track. The track The Panther, a funky blues song, while The Blues Walk is a peppy up-tempo blues song. There's a catchy tune called Miss Miniver, a Dexter Gordon original composition. Body and Soul is a beautiful duet between drummer Alan Dawson and Dexter on saxophone. So that was a compilation of some of Dexter Gordon's best albums of all time, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break, be right back after that. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode of the Jazz Update, it's about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon Dexter Gordon. We've come to an end of the Jazz Update for today, so now it's time to recap what we were talking about on this program. Dexter Gordon was an iconic composer, saxophonist and bandleader. He was also one of the pioneers in the behop genre of jazz. His career spanned more than 40 years. He was characterized by his typical large and spacious style of music. His early influences included Lester Young, Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane. They largely shaped his hard bop style during the 60s. He was also well known for his charismatic stage presence. He was famous for his approach to performing, which he said was all about connecting with the audience. In 1986, he was awarded a Grammy Award for Best Jazz Instrumental Performance Soloist for his album The Other Side of Round Midnight, released on Blue Note Records the same year. In 2016, another album of his called Go was selected by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically or aesthetically significant. So Dexter Gordon's albums were all about finding the line between the innovative, the experimental and the traditional. In the middle of his career, he traveled to Europe where he toured for 14 years. In 1970, he returned to the USA to massive acclaim. His performances during the 1970s are credited as being some of the most influential in the revival of acoustic jazz performances in the jazz fusion era. During this time, he recorded several great jazz albums like Dexter Calling, Night at the Village Vanguard and more. Here's a quick recap of some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Dexter Calling, released in 1961. So Dexter released this album during his time at Blue Note Records, his second album release with the label. Another album called Our Man in Paris, released in 1963. So during this time, Dexter Gordon was enjoying widespread fame nationally and internationally. He'd been touring Europe at the time, and his success in his live performances and his album releases resulted in him living in Paris for a few years. So Our Man in Paris was released at this time and contained a series of jazz classics that showcased Gordon and his band's versatility and creativity. Homecoming, Night at the Village Vanguard was released in 1977. This one was recorded during Gordon's time in Europe, where he was touring to massive success, and yet while he was in Europe, he missed out on the electronic jazz movement spreading across the USA at the time. In the continent, he was mainly into acoustic jazz styles of music. Another album called Go, released in 1962. This is easily one of Dexter's best albums of all time. This album is to some extent inspired by his first landmark album, Dexter Calling. On this album, Gordon is on tenor saxophone, Sonny Clark is on piano, Butch Warren is on bass, and Billy Higgins is on drums. Together, they weave their way in and out of beautiful melodies. So this album blends the same hard bop influences on Dexter Calling, also some of John Coltrane and Sonny Rollins' playing styles. So this album shows off Gordon's creative side with classics like I Guess I'll Hang My Tears Out to Dry and Love for Sale. Also, this album showcases how well Gordon connects with the audience in a live performance. It's full of the typical joy and passion that characterized his live shows. And an album called Body and Soul, released in 1967. So this album is taken from a live performance by Dexter and his band at the famous Montmartre Club in Copenhagen. In this album, we see Dexter and his quartet, pianist Kenny Drew, bassist Niels Orsted, and drummer Albert Hart take on some much beloved classics like Come Rain or Come Shine, Body and Soul, and Blues Walk. So that was a quick recap of everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva, and that brings me to an end of today's episode of the Jazz Update. You can check out my YouTube channel for archives of today's show on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.